of our climate smart farming team. And boy, she works even further north than I do, where it's probably still snow on the ground and they don't have their last frost date until mid-June. So you can feel sorry for her. And some of my examples are coming out of Kitty's examples. So they will have a distinctively cold bias. But anyway.
And then you can just
ahead.
Olive oil and a little bit of salt.
Just to kind of set the stage, if we look at some observed data across the Northeast over the last 100 or so years, actually probably close to 130 years here, we see a distinct upward trend in average annual temperature across the region. The long-term average through the 1900s was about 45 degrees across the region. And as you can see in the more recent years in this record here, we're averaging closer to 48 degrees. So pretty remarkable trend there in annual average temperature. If we kind of maybe focus in a little bit on New Jersey and look at the seasons, we see a very similar pattern. Summer temperatures have basically increased by almost 4 degrees Fahrenheit since their average over the long term, and really the same thing for winter. So we really see this same phenomena regardless of when we are in the year. I didn't have a good New Jersey example, but if I look across the state of New York and try to figure out maybe what the growing season looks like, and I'm doing a very simple example here, just looking at the time between the last 32 degrees in the spring and the first 32 degrees in the fall. Again, over the 1900s, the length of the frost-free season has increased by about 10 days during this time frame, with a lot of the change occurring pretty much in the last 50 years. If we want to maybe project this out into the future, so I'm looking at maximum temperatures in New Jersey. If I look at kind of the recent kind of 20-year period in here, straddling the year 2000, we see the observed data say the average maximum temperature is about 84 degrees Fahrenheit. And then what I show going out into the future, these are climate model projections of what summer maximum temperature in New Jersey will look like. And basically the way it's designed is this middle line between the red and the blue is kind of the average of several, about 30 different climate models actually. And then the tops of the red band and the bottom of the blue band are the warmest and the coldest of these models. And I think you'll see that regardless of which model we choose, we're on an upward trend and definitely will be warmer than we were in the past.
New Jersey.
In some cases here by the end of the century, this average summer max temperature in New Jersey will be almost 10 degrees Fahrenheit warmer. We can see the same thing. Basically, this isn't, I should have mentioned that the first graph is if we continue to kind of emit greenhouse gases at our current rate, if we do something a little bit more sustainable, maybe something in line of some of the proposals that have been floated to bring us into the Paris Accord and things like that, we see that kind of if we flip between the two slides, not much change actually in the middle of this century, but by the end of the century, we almost half the amount of warming. So again, an average summer day in New Jersey, by the end of the century might be something like 93 on average, and maybe more like 88 on average if we have lower emissions. The frost dates also change, and real quickly, I'm showing the date of the last spring frost on the right, on the left, and the first fall frost on the right. A lot of detail here, but the take-home message is by mid-century, the climate models project about a 2-week lengthening in the spring and an additional 2-week lengthening in the fall. So basically a month longer of the frost-free season. And going out to the end of the century, the maps get very, very red under a high emissions scenario. Basically, in a lot of places in central and southern New Jersey, almost 30 days more on either end of the season. So a 60-day longer window without frost in the state.
Art,
So maybe
say high emission scenario, what does that mean exactly?
Yeah, basically, when I'm saying a high emission scenario, it's kind of if we continue emitting greenhouse gases at the same rate of change that we've seen. So emissions go up, but they follow that trend that we've been doing basically over the last 50 years. So right now we emit about 7 gigatons, billions of tons of carbon into the atmosphere each year. Under the high emission scenario, that would be something like 28 gigatons, 7 times more each year because we increase that rate of emissions. So, maybe you're saying, boy, maybe I can plant earlier, maybe I can do things, and that might be the case. And I really think the take-home message and why maybe Nagisa asked me to give this talk is a premise, is at least with the people in the ag fields that I work with, they do things a lot on the calendar. And kind of the premise here is maybe we should throw away the calendar and really be more in tune to what the weather conditions are telling us. We also have to be worried about other things in the system. And this is a real complicated graph, but really what I wanted to say is even though the frost-free season is extending, particularly in the spring, when you think you might be able to get out into the field a lot earlier, what's going on at the same time is rainfall is really increasing a lot at that time of year. So that kind of spot in kind of early April, maybe late March with the extended growing season is really where we see the biggest changes in rainfall. So there still might be trouble with actually getting out into the field, even though the frost isn't the thing that's keeping you out. So what I want to do is at least introduce this concept of growing degree days that are used a lot in many of the applications that we provide decision tools for through the Climate Center. And really what it is, it's a way of relating the development of plants and insects to basically the accumulation of heat. So a growing degree day is really a heat accumulation. So you accumulate basically temperature over many days. They're used extensively, like I said, to predict certain stages of crop maturity, insect pest emergence, weed emergence, perhaps. So they are really a useful indicator for kind of timing different things that you might do out in the field, particularly not when with the changing climate, kind of getting away from the idea of basing it on the calendar, which really is still rooted in the use of degree days and climate normals, but it's basically assuming that the climate of the past hasn't or isn't going to change. The concept of the degree day is pretty simple. And basically the idea is, the species that you're dealing with is really what's important. There's different flavors, so to speak, of degree days, but really the calculation of them is fairly simple from the temperature record. They're computed on a daily basis. And basically what is done is the warmest temperature of the day is added to the coldest temperature of the day. And that's divided by 2. So it generally gives you an average. And then from that average, you subtract the base temperature, which gives you a degree day. And like I said, that base temperature varies with really the decision or the crop or the species that we're dealing with. It might be 50 degrees Fahrenheit for corn. Typically most small grains or leafy crops in the spring are something more like 32. Use 32 quite often actually with the turf grass industry for seed head development and turf grass. If we move to field pests, something like the alfalfa weevil is 48. We work with apple trees and that's more like 41 or 42. Cabbage maggot, 39. So really these are determined more or less experimentally, either in the lab or field, depending on the pest that we're looking at. Some species also have an upper limit. Corn is a great example of that, where basically if it gets warmer than about 86 degrees Fahrenheit, that added temperature is really of no additional use to the corn and actually is detrimental to the corn development. So in some cases, we add this upper threshold. So the example here is the minimum temperature stays what it is observed during the day, But on the other end of the scale, if the maximum temperature is warmer than 86, it's set to 86. So we couldn't have a 90 there, for instance. And you can look at an example. If I'm looking at alfalfa weevil, whose base temperature is 48 degrees, and I look at maybe a spring day where the minimum temperature is 35 and the maximum temperature is 65, I'm just adding those two together, dividing by 2 to get 50. I'm subtracting off the base temperature, and that day would accumulate 2 degree days. If I was working with a corn example, for instance, where the upper threshold matters, and let's say, so for corn, the base is always 50, but we're using this upper limit equation for degree days. So on a day when the minimum temperature is 60 degrees, but the maximum temperature is 90, the degree day calculation would look like this. We use the 60 as the min, but the maximum would be set back to 86, that upper threshold, and we'd proceed as normal. So this day would accumulate 23 degree days. And to give you an idea of some of the different kind of uses of degree days, in field corn, basically in the fall, basically harvest is kind of indicated by dry matter content of about 32%. And through research, basically that is achieved somewhere between 750 and 800 base 8650 degree days after the corn tassels and silks. So in kind of the lingo that I'm going to use, the time that you start to accumulate the degree days from is called the biofix. So in this case, it would be the silking date. It'd be something you'd observe in the field, and then you start to accumulate the right degree days, in this case, 8650. If we're maybe looking for alfalfa weevil, again, the research would show that alfalfa weevil hatches at about 280 growing degree days, base 48. And the biofix in this case is if you're scouting after you consistently observe adults in your traps. So that would be the way you would use this calculation. I apologize for the bad example, perhaps in the last one with herbicide timing, but actually quite useful also for cultivation for weeds. So basically you could take a species like foxtail and predict emergence thereafter about 400 degree days. So that, where you have 50% of the seeds would emerge. So that might be a good time to go in and cultivate. If we look at how these degree days are expected to change through time, I'm looking at base 50 degree days, again, averaged across New Jersey. And in the current climate, basically 3,200 growing degree days accumulate in a season. And you can see, again, under a higher emissions scenario, by the mid-century, 1,000 more degree days. And by the end of the century, about 2,000 more degree days. So clearly the past climate that a lot of the calendar is based on, here in the dots, is going to be very different from what we expect to see even in the near-term future. So what I'd like to introduce is really how we at the Climate Center put this all together into kind of I think a pretty succinct and hopefully you'll find easy to use web application. The URL is up there at the top of the screen. Sorry, I didn't continue that on my other slides, but if you Google climatesmartfarming.org, it'll take you to the main page and then you can navigate to the tools. So the growing degree day site will look something like this, and kind of let's step through it in a bit. So basically really need 3 inputs to the growing degree day calculator. We need to know where you are. We need to know a location, where the field is. And basically that's done through an interactive map. You can either enter in an address or point and click on the map, and that will allow you to select a location and actually set a pin. So I've actually saved a couple of different locations here in New York, and my selected one is kind of almost my backyard here in Ithaca. So you can select your location. The site remembers that the next time you come back, so you don't have to do this every time. The next thing that required is really, what is that biofix date? When do we start accumulating the growing degree days? So that's done here. Maybe a bit of a misnomer in the site. It's labeled as planting date, but you can see really in a couple of the examples I'll work through, that can be the silking data if we're looking at harvest, or perhaps a different, when we see insects in our traps for something like that for a pest application. So really it really should be that biofix date there. And again, you can enter in the date as you see it, or you can use the handy calendar app to set that date. And again, when you navigate back to the site, it'll be your last selection will be remembered. And then the last thing is really, what is our application? So what base temperature, what threshold is needed? And kind of here, there's this drop-down menu. So there's a number of different common choices. I think it goes beyond what I'm showing there. I think there's, down to 32 and things like that. So you can easily select that or type it in. So really, that's the, that's what the tool needs to know about you. What basically we provide to the tool is the meteorological data for your location. And again, with degree days, we're mainly talking about air temperature. We do that by monitoring data from a number of sites across our region. Each of those dots is a weather station. And then on top of that, we also kind of use a meteorological model, almost the same type of model that you might see if you kind of go to your weather app this morning, and it tells you what the temperature is going to be maybe this afternoon or in the next couple of hours. So it's a very short-term weather forecast that we use to kind of get, fill in all the spaces where there really aren't weather stations. And in New York, obviously, although there's not much ag, but up in the Adirondacks, we have a few weather stations, some problems down here in parts of the Hudson Valley. New Jersey's pretty well covered, except maybe the Pine Barrens. And it's really the data from these weather models that we put in there to fill in the gaps. But more importantly, wherever we have a weather station and the data from these models, we can estimate how far off the models are and actually correct the models based on the ground truth observations. So if I kind of look at the lay of the land of the degree day calculator, a bunch of different lines. This is a recent example. So the green line represents what's happened so far this growing season, and it's early, at least when I started this back in January, so it's down near zero. The little red line is a 6-day forecast. So we bring in forecast data for the next 6 days. And then what you see kind of as the lines spread out into the future, what this is showing, at least for my location here in Ithaca, I'm looking back at the historical record of data from Ithaca. And what I'm showing is the purple line is the last 30 years average. So basically on average, this is how degree days accumulate, or how they have accumulated over the last 30 years. The blue line represents the last 15 years. So it's really more in tune to this idea of a changing climate, that if we use 30 years of data, what happened 30 years ago is really not what we see today. And you kind of see that in the lines in almost any station you'll pick. The 15-year line is higher than the 30-year line, again, because of the warming climate. And then the gray area represents basically the historical kind of max and min. So the top is the fastest accumulation of degree days in a season at Ithaca, and the bottom is the slowest. The other thing that the tool has with these little lines down at the bottom those are the historical occurrences of frost. So it kind of tunes these degree days into when we would expect to see the last spring frost and the first fall frost at a location. So I'm going to do some examples. I'm going to use Messina, New York, or a place near Messina, New York as my first example. So my farm is near Constantinople, New York. So I've used that I picked my location. I'm interested in corn. So I'm using a base 50 for my corn. And I've chosen to grow 45-day corn, which matures at 2050 base 8650 degree days. So I've chose 8650 degree days. I planted that corn on May 25th. And what this little slider does is enable me to kind of set a line for my target. And my target here is 250. because that's when my corn matures. So I'm basically asking myself in this case, if I planted my corn on May 25th, my biofix date, what is the chance that I will mature by, let's say, maybe before the first frost? So in this example from last season, that's what I did. And actually my target, my corn matured the earliest that it ever did. Last growing season on Constable was right at the maximum. So that corn matured very, very early in early September. But if I kind of look at this green area, which represents the target window, there are some seasons in the historical record where that corn would have never matured. We would have never reached the 250 target degree days in that case. So maybe by looking at this and hearing what I said earlier, maybe you might say, maybe I can grow a longer variety corn, get more yield, or maybe I could plant earlier on May 10th. And the calculator allows us to do that. So if I did plant 105-day corn in this season, it requires more degree days to mature, 2150. So I moved my target to 2150. I changed my planting date to earlier. So I'm still maybe risking some early frost, perhaps. It's still that warm 2020 growing season. And lo and behold, yes, I would have been able to kind of pull this off. I would have had no problem harvesting that corn on September 4th, well before the first frost has ever occurred at this location. But if I maybe look at the average here, the blue line, the 15-year average, that's occurring maybe more on September 23rd, where I do run the risk of frost. So maybe I don't want to risk growing that type of maturity corn just yet. There it is there. So I still have, 3 occurrences of frost have occurred before that average date. So kind of can use this to make that decision in terms of what you might want to plant or what mix of varieties you might want to plant. Where we use this quite a bit actually is when it's been delayed, planting has been delayed in the spring, and people are looking to make some decisions on maybe whether they should swap varieties because they had to plant so late, or perhaps actually even look at different crops. So you could use the degree day calculator to kind of put an artificial planting date in there and your corn variety to see what might be the best to actually get a yield in a particular growing season. Here would be another example of using a different biofix. So again, here's an example where we were in Arcade, New York, and wondering actually the late planted corn, will it really mature before the frost? So research by Bill Cox here at Cornell says you need about 800 degree days after silking to reach harvest for silage. So basically what's done here is the corn was planted. It's silked on July 30th. So we've set that as our planting date, even though it's the silking date. We're targeting 775 in the middle of that range to say, do we reach that? And in this example, using the calculator, well, in most years, yes, on average, yes, but there is still this risk. In one case, you might get zapped with frost before you actually reach the proper dry matter for harvest. And I think one last example here is, again, another delayed planting situation up here in upstate New York, where maybe instead looking to maybe plant summer planted forage oats instead. They require about 700 degree days. They're a small grain, so base 32 would be their GDD base. And basically the idea would be, when can I plant them to basically get them in before the first frost? So in this example, again, playing around with the planting date, putting them in on August 1st would basically get those in before the first observed frost in the period of record. So basically, I think my time is about up. So yeah, Emily has the top build here, so I don't want to take away from her. But basically, basically looking at this degree day calculator app, we provide the weather data and a lot of different kind of decisions that could be made in terms of management and things along those lines, both in a longer range seasonal forecast. But I guess I should mention also that that 7-day short-term weather forecast is in there as well. So a lot of uses of this tool also in that time frame as well. So with that, I will end mine.
Let me just open it up for questions. Let me see if anybody has any questions. And also, I'm just curious. Can you talk a little bit about the way you can predict the pest emergence with growing degree days?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Oh, yeah. Can you talk a little bit about pests and growing degree days?
Yeah, I think it's very similar to crops. For example, cabbage maggot. They're using a lower base, and for cabbage maggot, several generations during the season. So really, the biofix is kind of that you look at your trap catch of one. I believe it's an adult. When you see adults in your trap. And then you could, from the degree days, knowing the correct accumulation, you could kind of start to worry about when you're going to start get hatching of the second generation. A lot of use now with that in numbers of generations across the region. In recent years, we're getting enough degree days for that pest in particular that we're seeing an additional generation. Up here, we normally see 2 generations. But have quite often experienced a third. And I think down in New Jersey and Delaware, southern Pennsylvania, they've been seeing a 4th generation where they normally would see 3. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Does anybody have any questions for Art? You can unmute yourselves to ask a question if you like.
Yeah, this is Lynn. How do you
Hi, Lynn.
figure out the base? Is there something on your website that tells you that if you're looking at a different species of product?
There should be. If there isn't, I know on the Climate Smart Farming website, I think it's left up to you to decide the base. I would admit we do have a companion site that is more not just degree days, but really they use the degree days, but are more tuned to the exact pest or the exact decision. And there, of course, the base is incorporated into that. That's actually, we do that actually a lot with that site. A lot of weather stations in New Jersey actually on farmers' fields, some actually high quality weather stations across the state that feed into that from actually the Rutgers network. And same thing if you're in Delaware, we're actually very soon going to start working very closely with Delaware on some of that from the weather stations in that state.
So
Thank
Art,
you.
can you put that that site on the chat?
I can. I definitely will. But I'll put both of them on the chat. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, thank you.
Yep. I will throw them in there.
All right. Anybody else? Okay, well, then we're going to switch over to Emily from the University of Delaware, and she's going to talk about heat-resistant varieties.
Okay. I am going to try and share my screen. Okay, do you see something blue that says heat tolerant vegetable varieties? Okay, so my name's Emily Ernest and I work for Cooperative Extension in Delaware for University of Delaware. I have been working with the vegetable and fruit program, doing a lot of variety trials for different vegetable crops. I've been there since 2004, so done a lot of trials over the years. So I'm finally getting some things together. And a lot of the work we have been doing recently is to look at varieties under heat stress. We plant at a time when we know that that particular crop is going to experience heat stress during its susceptible stage, and then do evaluation, especially for quality, because a lot of vegetables, of course, experience quality loss when you have heat stress. Are you actually seeing presentation mode, or are you just seeing, is it not in presenter mode?
We're not seeing presenter mode, but we can see the slides pretty well.
Okay.
Because
All right.
I know that it can be a problem.
Yeah, let me try and fix that.
Okay, great.
Is it in presenter mode now? Or-
Yes,
Okay.
thank you.
Okay, so usually we think of vegetable crops in two categories. We think of the cool season crops, like the cole crops, cauliflower, broccoli, and cabbage. Peas are a cool season crop, and lettuce. These are the things we plant early in the spring and also for the fall. And we think of them as not being very heat tolerant. Cabbage is actually pretty heat tolerant. And I'm going to talk later on about trials that we've done with broccoli and cauliflower, looking for varieties that are more heat tolerant. Doesn't mean that you're going to be able to grow them all summer long, especially not in Delaware, maybe further north, but there is a gradient of heat tolerance in some of these crops. I would say maybe not, I haven't seen too many heat tolerant peas. And then we think of warm season crops. A lot of the solanaceous crops, peppers and eggplants, sweet potatoes, of course, things that we think that we associate with being grown in the southern part of the US, okra. And a lot of them are quite heat tolerant. I wanted to mention that two of the crops that we think of as being extremely heat tolerant, watermelons and cowpeas or black-eyed peas. For watermelons, there are actually some heat susceptible varieties, and which we have discovered in Delaware. And black-eyed peas are very heat tolerant because of extensive breeding work to develop heat tolerant varieties. Now, there is a lot of heat tolerance in that species, which made it possible and maybe a little bit easier, but University of California in the early 1980s did an enormous amount of breeding work to develop extremely heat tolerant cowpeas. And that's mostly what, or the basis for the cowpeas that are grown today and have a lot of heat tolerance. And so then there are some vegetables where you can see heat stress effects, but there are variety differences. And there's potential to have heat tolerant varieties for these crops. I've shown pictures here of a bunch of the ones that we've done trials on. I have a picture of lima beans because that's the crop where I am actually doing breeding work, not just variety trialing. And I have done a lot of work with heat tolerance on lima beans, but I'm not going to talk any more about lima beans during this presentation. If you want to hear about lima beans, you can talk to me later. But we've done a lot of trials with snap beans because that's an important crop for Delaware. We have fresh market and processing snap bean production. We've done some work with broccoli and cauliflower. We've done a fair number of trials with lettuce, looking for heat tolerant varieties. I'm not going to talk about our tomato results because we really haven't found ones that we really like. If you want to ask me about that, you can send me an email and I can direct you to some trial results, but we're still not totally satisfied with what we've trialed for tomatoes. It doesn't stand up to our extreme conditions. So this is the wordiest slide in this presentation, and I'm going to stop after I go through it and make sure everybody is still on board. But I needed to talk a little bit about how heat and drought stress interact with one another. So they are related and they often occur together. And heat stress exacerbates drought stress and vice versa. So if your plants are not well watered, then they are more likely to experience heat stress. And if they are heat stress, because the temperatures are high, they are more likely to experience drought stress. But the effects on the physiology of the plant, what's actually going on is different for heat stress and drought stress. So with drought stress, the primary thing that's happening is the plant doesn't have enough water. So it closes its stomates. So it's like it shuts all the windows. And that the result of that is that photosynthesis can't proceed because the plant can't bring in the carbon dioxide that it needs for photosynthesis, and the oxygen can't go out. So when the stomates shut down for a long period of time because the plant doesn't have enough water, you don't have photosynthesis going on. And so sort of chronic low-level drought stress reduces photosynthesis. Heat stress actually causes physical damage to the plant by causing proteins to like get deformed, or the membranes that separate cells and keep the different cell contents where they are supposed to be, they become more fluid and things start leaking into places that they're not supposed to be. So you can think of heat stress as causing actual physical damage to the plant, whereas drought stress sort of just slows down sugar production. And there are synergistic effects of drought on heat stress. So the drought stress plants, like I said, they close all the stomates to keep the plant from losing too much water and wilting. But because the stomates are closed, not only is photosynthesis shut down, but the plant loses its ability to cool itself off through evapotranspiration. So the water is not transpiring from the leaves anymore. And that is the way the plant cools itself. So of course the plant starts to heat up. Measuring leaf temperature is a good way to know whether your plant is drought stressed, because leaves will start to heat up as soon as the stomates shut down. So your leaves get hotter, and then of course they get hotter, get heat. When you have high temperatures, you're more likely to have drought stress because it's going to increase the rate of evapotranspiration when temperatures are higher. And of course, when those evapotranspiration rates are higher, the plant's going to use more water, and it's more likely that there's going to be not enough water available to the plant. The point of everything that I'm trying to say here is that irrigation, providing enough water for your plants, can completely solve the problem of drought stress, but it can only mitigate the problem of heat stress. So if you have high temperatures, it's very important to make sure that your plants are well watered, but it will not completely fix the problem of high temperatures. You can have very well watered plants that still have physiological disorders and quality loss because of heat stress, the temperatures being too high. Now, I want to make sure if anybody have any questions about any of that before I keep rolling, because the rest of this presentation is very different.
Anyone want to ask a question? Sounds like everyone's good.
All right.
We're very clear. Thank you.
Okay, so the next part of this presentation, I'm going to show you some pictures of horrible looking vegetables, which have experienced heat stress, and talk about sort of the susceptible stage to heat stress. And then I'm going to show you some pictures of the resistant varieties that we have identified for these crops. So broccoli is a cool season crop. The stage that the broccoli is susceptible to heat stress is right when the plant is transitioning from vegetative growth to reproductive. And it is not an obvious stage. It's long before you can actually see a tiny head of broccoli forming in the center of the plant. And that stage, depending on the temperatures, which of course influence the rate of development, lasts 5 to 10 days. And if the plants experience temperatures above 86 degrees during that time period, then you're going to get these lumpy, bumpy heads with uneven bead sizes and often some discoloration. It also can cause the leaves growing out of places that you don't expect to have leaves for broccoli. So this kind of damage in broccoli, it happened weeks before these heads were harvested. So when they have been screening broccoli for heat stress, they're screening at the susceptible stage. And actually the plants will tolerate some heat after that susceptible stage, and you won't develop this quality issue, which will cause it to be unmarketable. So my colleague Gordon Johnson has been doing a bunch of broccoli trials, both in the spring and the fall over the past several years. The two varieties that we have found that work most consistently are called Eastern Crown and Millennium. They're both varieties from Cicada. There is also a group that has been working to develop varieties that are adapted to Eastern production in the eastern part of the US. They have trials that are running from Florida to Maine to try to develop a system where we can have East Coast grown broccoli throughout the season. That is the website there where they talk about the varieties that they are developing. Eastern Crown and Millennium are some that have been in their trials as well. So hopefully they'll be developing some new varieties and making them available. Cauliflower is a crop that it remains susceptible to high temperatures throughout its entire growth cycle. So you can get uneven head development like with broccoli, but then heat stress later on in the growing season can cause purpling in some varieties, what's called riciness, which is on the white background up here, that separation of the curd, or this fuzziness that you see on the bottom ones that look a little bit yellowed also. The formation of leaves around those are all sort of physiological issues. Trials over the past 2 years. So in the spring, which is the difficult time for us to grow cauliflower, we had 3 varieties that had very high percentages of plants producing marketable heads, and they are Bishop, Bermeo, and Denali. In case you're madly writing down these varieties, I did send Nagisa a PDF of this presentation so that you can ask her for that later, so you don't have to be trying to scribble down these.
Are you
Yes.
saying that your cauliflower look like this compared to the other cauliflower pictures?
Again, these are actual pictures of my actual cauliflower. I did not steal them from the seed company pictures.
Just checking, because these look beautiful. And I
know,
I
was very
resemble the
pleased.
pictures in the previous slide. So
Well, see, I also had a lot of cauliflower. Like I also took those pictures in the previous slide. So I had 17 varieties in the trial and only 3 of them looked like this. The other 14 looked like the previous slide.
okay, well, that's good to know.
Okay, so yeah, looking for the diamonds in the rough. And then the fall trials, I had a fall trial in 2019, and then I retrialed these successful varieties in 2020, and they all looked good again. So some of the same ones that looked good in the spring, and then a few added ones that did good in the fall. These, and so fall is a better time for growing cauliflower just all around. So that's why there were more varieties that were successful then. Again, these are actual pictures of the cauliflower that I grew. And the ones that there are no pictures of, they probably looked purple or ricey or fuzzy. Okay, so lettuce. Any of you who have grown lettuce, I'm sure you know that high temperatures inhibit germination, and later on in the season, they can lead to bolting and bitterness in lettuce, which makes it pretty much inedible. I did a bunch of variety or trials with lettuce several years ago, and then I've done some more work recently. This picture of all the little miniature Christmas trees is one of my fall trials. And then up here in the front, you can see there are a few plants where the varieties didn't bolt. So those were quite bolting resistant, as opposed to some of these over here on the right. I also tortured myself by tasting all of the lettuce varieties, whether they bolted or not in these trials, to see if they were bitter. This is in the name of science, I guess. Yeah, so these are varieties that have been resistant to bolting and becoming bitter in my trials over the years. So Dove and Arroyo are romaine types. Skyphos and Borlina are butterhead, and so are the two Salanova types. So those are the multi-leaf lettuces. So Salanova green butter and Salanova red butter, and Starfighter is a green, like leafy thing, I don't know, leaf lettuce. Okay, and I have done a bunch of trials looking at using shade cloth, and I'm going to talk about them more and when we have the thing in September, but I just wanted to mention that I've had, there's an additive effect of combining shade cloth with heat tolerant varieties. In all my trials, the heat tolerant variety is the most important component, but you can increase sort of the heat stress tolerance by adding shade cloth, or by adding shade cloth and white or reflective mulch to cool the soil. Heard somebody say that they were growing hydroponic lettuce in the greenhouse in Florida in the summer, and they were doing it by cooling the water to 80 degrees. And so I thought I'd try cooling the soil, and it seems to have a pretty good effect. Okay, sweet corn. With sweet corn, when we have high temperatures, sometimes we see this leaf scald, and that does not always, that's right, response. Some varieties do that more than others, and sometimes depending for quality loss, and sometimes it has. With heat stress, we tend to see poor tip fill because of the pollination. The pollen is not as viable, or the silks dry out too quickly. And then the reduced ear diameter, those skinny sort of silly looking ears that are on the left-hand side of the picture. The way I look at sweet corn, heat tolerance is we do multiple planting dates. So this is the only chart I'm showing you, but so this is from our 2019 trial. This is bicolor super sweet varieties. And we had 3 planting dates. The first one was mid-April, the second one was mid-May, and the third one was mid-June. The mid-May planting, which is the orange bars, experienced a lot of heat stress in July. Close to harvest, and we saw reduced yields in most varieties in that time frame. But you can see that there are 2 varieties that had quite or a lot better yields than the others in that time period, Affection and Nirvana. So they look to be more heat and stress tolerant. And so from our past sweet corn work, super sweet, bicolor super sweet varieties that are heat tolerant, Affection and Nirvana that I just showed you, white super sweet varieties that have looked good, Extra Tender 378A and XTH 3174. And in the white SE class, Whiteout and Mattapoisett had good yields under heat stress. And then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about beans. So I mentioned that I do a lot of work with lima beans and heat stress in lima beans and snap beans. Same sort of physiological things going on. With beans, it is the nighttime temperatures that are most important. And And that is because the susceptible part of the plant and the susceptible stage is the flowering stage. And they're most susceptible actually before the flowers open. High night temperatures, and by high night temperatures, I mean anything over 68 degrees Fahrenheit is going to cause damage to the anthers, and the anthers will not open up and release the pollen when the flowers open. And also see a situation where the pollen might not be as viable. So the pollen has to germinate once it lands on the stigma to cause fertilization, and the pollen, even if it lands on the stigma, might not be any good. So this can result in you don't have any pods at all, or you have these lumpy short pods with not very many seeds in them. And you'll either have reduced yield, you'll have split sets with not all your pods maturing at the same time, or you'll just have no yield. So here I am showing you pictures. On the top, PV 857 and Bridger are 2 heat tolerant varieties, and Caprice and Affirmed are 2 heat susceptible varieties. And these are the pods, like 200 grams of pods harvested and then graded out by quality. So the fancy class and the #1 class are considered marketable. So those are pods that, you know, have all the beans in them that they're supposed to, so that they're nice and straight and not curved and lumpy. And then the culls are going to be short and bent and kind of funky looking. You can see that PV 857 has most of the pods ending up in the 2 marketable groups, Fancy and #1, whereas Caprice hardly has any in the fancy category and nearly everything in the cull category. So there is, in addition to the quality issues with snap beans, like here I had the same amount of pods that I was grading out. There was also yield loss. So Caprice produced about half the weight of pods of PV 857. So as far as heat tolerant snap bean varieties that I have identified in trials over the past couple of years, probably the best one is PV 857. I've had it in a lot of trials. Annihilator and Dominator from Pure Line Seeds sound really scary, but they were pretty good varieties. Varieties that have looked good. And then on the flat potted side of thing, Usambara is produced really nice beans, and it was the highest yielding variety in my heat stress trial and in my unstressed trial. I have 5 pounds of untreated PV 857 seed. So if anybody wants to try PV 857, you can email me and I will send you some. Okay, that's it. I'll take questions.
Okay, everyone, you can all unmute. I'll unmute all of you. Or I'll ask you all to unmute. You can feel free to ask any questions you have. Emily, I actually have a question going back to the slide right before you started corn, I think. You said you cooled the soil. How did you do that?
Okay, so with both the shade cloth, let me see if I can go back to. So in this picture right here, this is a picture of my shade cloth trial. People wondered why I was putting stakes in my lettuce, because lettuce doesn't really need stakes, but does if you're putting shade cloth on it. Here I was looking at different colors of shade cloth. This was all 30% shade cloth, except I had 2 different levels of white. But so I had silver, red, blue, black, and 2 different white ones, and then unshaded. Here I have taken all the shade cloth off because we're about to pick that. And so here I'm cooling the soil by providing shade.
Okay.
And then in this picture, this was another sort of demo, like just a look-see trial that I did where I had white plastic mulch, and then the other end of this field, I had reflective aluminized plastic mulch. So those will both cool the soil by reflecting sunlight as opposed to black plastic mulch. And then I used on some of the plots, in addition to the mulch, I had shade cloth over the plants. So that's sort of like an extra cooling. And for this, in this little trial where I had the reflective mulch and the shade, I was able to harvest lettuce that I planted the last day of May and harvested in early July that was still quite tasty and edible, which in Delaware is kind of unheard of.
Mm.
So usually we're out of luck by the beginning of June.
Got it. All right. I guess it is that much warmer there than it is here. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm guessing that southern New Jersey is probably similar to
Right.
where I'm at.
Okay, does anybody have any questions for Emily?
Emily,
I do.
Okay.
Hi. Oh, go ahead.
Okay, Lynn, I guess, did you say you had a question?
yeah, but somebody else did too. So,
Yeah, I see her. I'll get her next.
was there any difference between the blue, red, and the white or black in terms of the growth, the shade cloth, the colors?
So for the lettuce and for the pepper studies that I've done, the black 30% shade cloth is for the peppers, it's better than the other colors. And for the lettuce, it is as good as the other colors. So I did not, usually black is the least expensive shade cloth that you can get. And there was not an advantage of using some of the colors for the lettuce. And the black was superior for peppers.
Great, thank you.
Randy had a question.
So Randy,
Yeah, I'm just wondering how much mulch of any kind would affect heat stress on the crops that you studied?
so some plants, I think, this category, it seems that lettuce falls into this category. Cooler soil temperature. Some plants just, their roots don't function very well in warm soil. So we have found that lettuce and tomatoes especially benefit from mulches that will provide a cooling effect. So in an organic situation, if you didn't want to use plastic mulch, you could try straw.
Great.
Yeah. I actually was hoping to do a repeat last year of that, the lettuce trial that's pictured here with the mulch, and try straw mulch with shade cloth over top, but COVID got in the way.
As it did for many things.
Yeah.
All right, anyone else?
I have a question about the lettuce. How many days or weeks are you ending your harvest by doing shade cloth and reflective mulch?
Sorry, I'm trying to see who I got. So who's talking to me? Stephanie. Okay. I would have to go back and look. But I would say to give you a perfect answer to that question, but I would say that in general, I would say I got a good 2 weeks and probably 3 weeks from the cooling mulch plus the shade plus the heat tolerant varieties over what I would get with just a typically performing variety. Does that make sense? So we have to, we plant in April, and we can usually get decent quality lettuce end of May, maybe beginning of June, and then we're done until the fall. Because it's too warm. In that trial with the heat tolerant varieties, plus the mulch, plus the shade, I was able to pick quality lettuce at the beginning of July. So that was, I would say, on the low side of extension, 3 weeks, and being optimistic 4.
Okay.
All right. Well, oh, Linda, do you have a question?
No, I don't. Thank you.
Okay, good. All right, very good. All right, well, thank you everyone for joining us this evening, and thank you Art and Emily for joining us as well and sharing your knowledge. I think it really is going to help New Jersey growers to look north and south to understand what we're learning scientifically with things like growing degree days and in the trials that Emily is doing to help guide what we know will be a warming climate, and we do need to understand what kind of varieties we can grow. So the two of you, thank you very much for taking an hour out of your busy days, and really appreciate it. And folks, if you would like the PDF, I will happily post it on our site and share it with everybody who registered for the session today. So thank you very much, and expect an email from me in the next day or so. All right.
Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Good night.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was great. Very
Good
instructive.
night.